It's ironic that once you read the history of a certain topic, like let's say the American Revolution, the Middle Ages, or for this example, the history of science, is that people who have spent their lives studying that topic will agree on certain conclusions, which are ironically often diametrically opposed to what the general public thinks about that topic. This is how I feel about the economy today. In science, normal people tend to think that all scientific discovery happens through some rigorous process which churns out perfect results. The reality is that what really happens is that some scientist gets intuition on an idea, and then they run a test to see whether or not it's true. This is how nearly every single scientific discovery has happened. This is how I feel about the economy today. It's become a cultural meme of how what the economy is on paper is nowhere close to what the reality is. I mean, just look outside for Christ's sake. On paper, our economy is apparently in good shape. If you look at all the numbers, everything is fine. That being said, if you look at anything else, it's so clear that that's not the case. If you look at what people self-report about their lives, things are not good. If you look at quality of life statistics, the financial state of the average household, cost of living, and about 40 other statistics, which we'll see over the course of this video, it becomes so clear that things aren't fine. That being said, the story of how the elites were able to hide it is fascinating in of itself. The rabbit hole goes really deep with this one. You'll be surprised to see how many issues with our society are uncovered by looking into how we lie with numbers. The economy is currently in rough shape, and while you can still work a job, that often doesn't actually cut it. Thankfully, there is a way to get more money without leaving your house and while expressing your opinion on topics you care about with YouGov, an internet-based marketing research company. They conduct polls on a variety of topics ranging from politics to pop culture, and you get paid for each poll. I really enjoy YouGov because they have polls on things that are relevant and interesting, things I actually care about and want to give my opinion on. It's a great way to fill time while I cook or have the TV on, and it makes it easy to buy stuff on Amazon or get coffee. It's easy to get lost in YouGov. It's free to join and the polls are easy, engaging, and interesting. And as a member, you'll earn points for giving your actual opinions on topics that matter. So click the link below and check out YouGov today. Part 1. The Flaws of Data. In my video on modern civilization, I talked about how the greatest sin of modernity is confusing the measurement of something with the thing itself. GDP is the economy. Happiness metrics are happiness itself. Increasing your statistical number is what growth and a good government looks like. The issue is that when you do this without intuition or common sense to balance it out, you end up with completely ridiculous results. As an example, if Genghis Khan scored a 95 on an IQ test, I would consider that to be a failing of the IQ test rather than Genghis Khan's stupidity. Genghis Khan is clearly a genius, and any test who wouldn't portray him as one is a bad test. That being said, a lot of people today would take the test over the actual outside reality of Genghis's achievements. This is the issue we run into with the economy, in which people believe official numbers before anything else. This opens up a very clear issue with modern logic, in which we have no grounding in reality, and thus it's very easy to get us to believe absurdities. An easy example of this is arguing that culture has no effect on society, and thus you can mix different populations together with no consequences. Alternately, that there are no real differences between men and women, thus you can change one for the other. These are things which the rest of history would find to be completely ridiculous, but we accept since we've lost any real grounding in the actual world. It always does shock me to see how disconnected moderns are from seeing things with their own eyes. For example, I'll have a conversation with people where I'll say stuff like, "That person we were talking to seemed really nervous," and my friend didn't even notice that the person was constantly fidgeting, clasping their hands, looking away, and had trouble making eye contact. Alternately, I'll say some political group is bloodthirsty, and the other person won't notice. Well, in their manifesto, it literally says their intentions are to kill people, but people still won't believe it. Modernity can be incredibly naive naive or gullible. There's this meme format which shows a bell curve where the most intelligent and most stupid believe some obvious truth, while the midwits are able to use the moderate amount of intelligence they have to deceive themselves. That's generally the case here with all of these numeric deceptions. The normies have been socialized to the point where they can only see things once their social elites have recognized them. Thus, the elites continue to massage the numbers so that the normies continue to cope that everything is still fine. There's this interesting book I like a lot called The Growth Delusion by Pilling. The book talks about how using total GDP as a metric to measure the economy, something that governments all around the world do all the time, results in bizarre social effects downstream of it. For example, the American healthcare system is legendarily inefficient, but it's ranked as good since it creates more economic growth due to being so inefficient that it needs a lot of money to keep running. Thus, politicians see that it creates jobs, thus is good, and don't pay attention to how wasteful it is. Alternately, lots of African countries actually have economies 6 times their size on GDP per capita due to weird bugs in how these numbers are measured. A video I've been meaning to make for a very long time on this topic is 12 Ways to Lie with Numbers, which is basically an account of all the ways statistics can be doctored to push a certain agenda, which is in reality not what's actually going on. An easy example of this is how the elites, basically until the social breaking point that took place under Trump or COVID, were able to use statistics to lie to the American public to say that their lives were getting better economically. Even as a teenager, I could listen to my parents talk about what America was like in their youth, or watch older movies, and it was clear that things had gotten worse economically for normal people. That being said, whenever I brought up these points, people would jump down my throat. Due to rises in total GDP, the party line was that the average American's life had gotten better since the 1970s. The reality is that if you adjust for cost of living, normal Americans' lives had gotten vastly poorer since 1970. Once Trump was in power, it created a reckoning amongst the American elite, which forced them to admit this, but it was taboo to bring up beforehand. It's also very similar to how I grew up in Pennsylvania, part of the Rust Belt, which got destroyed by deindustrialization. Meanwhile, if you brought up deindustrialization before Trump, you would get gaslit by society, which would tell you that nothing bad was happening. The thing I really don't understand about modernity is just the knee-jerk no to things it doesn't like. Where I was talking about these things before Trump, and if you had conversations with people about, hey, looks like average Americans' quality of life is getting worse, it wasn't even a discussion. They just immediately tell you that you were wrong and the statistics were against that. And growing up in the Rust Belt, I would talk to people and say, you know, all the buildings are decaying around us, and people didn't even notice, which shocked me. And modernity isn't interested in talking about things that it disagrees with. And I don't really know why we're so close-minded. The reason I'm going through all of this is to show 2 points, which I don't think people really think about, but ought to. The first is that the elites are very good at skewing official numbers to show the exact opposite of what's going on in the real world. They're also good at keeping up the facade for decades, in large part since I think a majority of the ruling class unironically believes the narrative of any given time, no matter how silly. Which leads me to the second point. If you've ever read the book 1984, they talk about how the party changes the narrative all the time, and memory holds whatever their previous reality was. There's a line in the book which goes, "We were always at war with East Asia." Well, in reality, that East Asia was their ally just a year before. Everyone conveniently forgets this, though. We do this to a ridiculous degree, and I can never believe how rapidly it occurs into such an extent, especially so in a liberal democratic society. For some examples, do you remember when saying COVID was a lab leak was treated as a conspiracy theory that you couldn't talk about and would face literal discrimination for bringing up? Conservatives keep complaining about how leftist government was so oppressive during COVID, but forget that the Trump presidency oversaw it. People forget how the narrative with Russiagate and Comey flip-flopped over the left loving or hating him about 5 times. We are able to completely change important narratives as a society very quickly without ever noticing that we did in the first place. Remember when Barack Obama didn't think gay marriage was a good idea? I find this terrifying, and it's so dystopian to see. I remember in high school looking at people around me and realizing there had to be a dating crisis. I just didn't see ways that young people would meet each other due to the digital nature of society. This was something that society never really talked about until 2022, when numbers came out that 2/3 of young men were single and 1/3 were virgins. The thing that freaks me out is that people need the statistics to see what's going on. They can't look around at the world to figure it out themselves. As a society, something can literally happen before our own very eyes, but we won't talk about it until the statistics are out from the government or Pew Research or something. I understand it's important to be rigorous and have evidence and all that stuff, but there's a difference between that and just being an idiot. Our society has a lot of the traits of schizophrenia. This includes a lack of sense of continuous reality over time, no sense of order to the universe, rapid changes in narrative, the sense that the world is a cold, chaotic place, emotional numbness, disorganized thinking, believing random stuff that we just rationalize later, delusions of grandeur at the same time as self-loathing. The thing is that, for reasons I will explain later, I think the economy is far, far worse than what any of the authorities are saying. In the next section, we're going to look at a variety of metrics which line up with, I think, most of your lived experiences, which operate as a sort of proxy to put together a puzzle that adds up to what's going on. I want to be totally transparent. I'm not an economist. My strength is in history and anthropology. I'm also not very good with numbers. There are people in this audience who know vastly more about this topic than I do. I want them to hold me accountable. What I am good at, however, is looking at different pieces of information and then piecing together a holistic picture of how that situation works. Although I'm not very good at looking at all the different economic models, my goal here is to use various discrete sources to intuitively figure out what's wrong with the modern economy. If I'm wrong, I'll be wrong, and I accept that. That being said, I don't believe in expert worship, and we can very clearly see that the experts in this field are very, very wrong. Thus, I don't want to leave this game to those who have studied it for their entire lives. For example, we are the society in history which has given the economists the most social authority or influence, but as you'll gradually see over the course of this video, at the same time, we are making some of the most profoundly stupid decisions of any society ever in history economically. I have a friend who's a professional economist and statistician who works at a think tank who I was talking to. He said that normal people's quality of life has remained constant since COVID. I told him that was completely ridiculous, and there was no way in hell that was possibly true. If the data says that, the data's wrong. Hey everybody, for a brief pause, you guys should check out my second channel, History 102, in which I go through various historic time periods to the Axial Age, the World Wars, or the Vikings to explain world history in 1-hour segments. Peace. Part 2, what's going on? Since my background's in anthropology, I spend more time thinking about how societies work on a holistic, different area level rather than just in economics. Effectively, does the society work as an organic whole? We have a bunch of metrics which assess this. When the pedal hits the metal, the society exists to serve the people inside of it, and so the question is, are the people all right? I especially try to look at statistics where people can't fake things, as in relating to their psychology or bodies. People can say whatever they want, but they can't lie through their body language, health, or mental well-being. All these numbers are at unironically the worst rates in human history. Every single statistic relating to mental health is at the worst point ever. People today sleep the least, are the fattest, most depressed, suicidal, they have less sex, are more mentally ill, marry the least, and have the least children, and even stuff like height is declining. By every single metric which would show the human character of society, we are massively failing. The thing is that a lot of these statistics are directly related to the economy, although there are other variables. If people are economically stressed, every single thing gets worse. It's impossible to have a society which is doing economically well and then have the issues seen above. There's just no statistical example of this. If the things above are true, it means that the economy is failing for most people. Let's expand this a little bit. A majority of Americans can't pay a $1,000 emergency bill. 40% can't pay a $400 emergency bill. When polled, the vast majority of Americans say they just can't afford basic life stuff. Gen Z has 90% less spending power than the baby boomers teenagers did at the same age. Normal young Americans spend 2/3 of their income on rent. America today has the lowest social mobility it has ever had in its history. At the top 20 universities in America, the top 1% of families economically make up 60% of the student body. The numbers are even worse for recent increases in cost of living. The cost of housing or rentals have nearly doubled since COVID. At the same time, basic essentials like food have gone up 50% since COVID. Wages have stagnated. This means that in a lot of ways, people are living on what is really half the income they had before COVID, which was a terrible standard of living beforehand as well. Inflation has erased a quarter of the value of money just since COVID. When I saw that, it enraged me, since I looked at my own pocketbook and realized how it affected me as an individual. I've seen this in my private life, where I had to adjust my entire business strategy around losing that money. As we'll say later in this video, inflation is effectively a tax on the poor who need physical money and exchanging it for the upper classes who own real estate or stocks, which are more so hedged against inflation. As an example of the elite skewing the statistics, they have kept inflation numbers artificially low by taking out any metrics that people actually use. The inflation is often the highest on the things that people need to survive. For example, for younger or lower class Americans, 2/3 of their money goes to rent, while housing prices have skyrocketed the most of almost anything. It's the same with food, medicine, college, and other things that dominate people's lives. It's nice that the price of electronics has stayed stable, but that's a drop in the bucket. Another example of this is that the regime likes to say that unemployment is low and that hiring is high. American unemployment stats are based off how many people are looking for jobs or filing for unemployment, which in of itself is a difficult and annoying process. This means that the real numbers are much higher than what the stats would suggest. When I first saw these stats, I didn't believe them, but basically all job growth since COVID has gone to immigrants. In fact, nearly 100%, which is absolutely insane. The regime is dealing with the decline in labor due to aging by flooding the country with low skill and low wage immigrants. This explains the disjoint between the lived reality and the statistics. There was an assessment of what the average amount of money needed to have a comfortable family life, like the kind the Simpsons used to have, and the cost goes from $300,000 in California to $170,000 in Mississippi. That's insane, since only around 10% of people make more than six figures. That means that for young people who are trying to form families, and they themselves are less likely to be in that top 10%, it's basically impossible for them to do so without sliding into poverty. This is a big reason why the birth rate keeps crashing. The amount of money needed to support a middle-class life has jumped from around $60K before COVID to $100K today. And to break down how absolutely insane that is, only about 10% of Americans make over $100K, and what that means indirectly is that 90% of the population is lower class, which is not what a first world country should look like. In that's what the Congo or medieval Europe were like, where 90% of the population are peasants and the top 10% are the nobility and the craftsmen and the priests. And if 90% of the population is poor, you have really, really failed. What we've pieced together is that you can make it look on the outside as if the economy is good. If you ask people to look at the objective numbers, the stock market, and economic growth, you can say things are fine. The American economy is expanding pretty rapidly while unemployment is pretty low. At the same time, this economy has basically no effect on the general population, who are economically struggling. This is a good place to work from in order to put the puzzle together. The most important and skeleton key variable here is inequality. We are one of the most unequal societies ever in human history. What this has effectively done is create a two-tiered economic system which are disconnected enough that it's hard to even imagine them existing in the same country at the same time. This means that we have an economy in which capital is doing very well, but labor isn't. Capital or money itself and those who own it, and labor or those who work, have been in permanent cooperation and competition for all of human history. When labor gets too strong, nothing can be accomplished accomplished since mass human cooperation becomes too expensive. This is a big reason Europe has declined vis-a-vis America since World War II, as their government regulations have artificially inflated the cost of labor, thus making Europe a non-competitive area economically. Meanwhile, when capital becomes too strong, you end up in situations like our current one, in which the stock market is doing well, as inequality surges, while normal people don't get any of the benefits of that. Our society is so ridiculously skewed towards capital for several different reasons. The first being is that we have a massive imbalance against labor. Our society over the last 50 years has basically done every single thing it could possibly have done to devalue the value of labor. This includes bringing women into the workforce, immigration, automation, globalization, or population growth. This is why productivity has gone up 70% since 1970, while wages have declined or stagnated. The supply of labor has overgrown the need by 40% since the 1970s. If you did all of these things, that this would be the end result, but people don't want to think about it. This is actually a really normal historic process in which periods of prosperity result in population growth and the growth in the net size of the economy while wages go down. This occurs every 250 years like clockwork and then results in social or political crises. Previous examples of this were the French Revolution, the 30 Years' War, or the Black Death. This is a topic I've covered to a remarkable extent in previous videos, so I'm going to keep this short, but the brief answer is that every single variable we would have before a crisis like this is happening in our current society. One of my favorite books ever is The Great Wave by David Hackett Fisher. It's a history of inflation over the last 1,000 years of Western history. It's brilliant and well written on every single level. It talks about all the factors I describe here. That being said, before each of these crises, you've seen the same variables again and again. Extreme inequality, political partisanship, inflation, the government printing a tremendous amount of money, increases in the cost of basic essentials, or real estate prices skyrocketing. All of this is happening now. In a century, I don't think the current economic issues will be remembered as economic issues, but rather the hard times that caused a revolution. Keep in mind, before the French Revolution, during the 30 Years' War, or before the Black Death, there were huge economic issues, but people don't remember them since they were overshadowed by the historic events that happened later. Like in each of those cases, normal people were caught in grueling poverty, while the stock market was stuck in insane bull runs. In each case, however, the stock market then crashed, killing the entire banking industry, which in turn lowered inequality, thus creating a hard reset. When the economy is as weird and disjointed as it is now, it's impossible for it to not reset. That being said, I don't think the result of this will be a Great Depression, but rather a war. It will be one side putting their enemies' heads on spikes, literally burning Silicon Valley or Wall Street. This sounds like a big claim, but if you want to know more, watch my half a dozen videos on this subject. A second reason the economy is so skewed towards capital is the demographics of a society are reflected in its economic system. The baby boomer generation is probably the most important generation in history, and especially so on an economic basis, where they have economically dominated whatever time period they were living in. Thus, when the baby boomers were young, the economy was growing on a vast level due to them just having jobs, kids, and buying homes. Then once they started to enter middle age, the global baby boomers started to accumulate property for retirement. This occurred over the 1980s and changed an economy from production and wage-based to capital and investment-based. The capital boom due to the baby boomers amassing money caused the massive economic surge of the Reagan cycle from 1980 until the present. This was the period of the most rapid economic growth in history. That being said, as the boomers have moved from middle to old age, this money is now being spent in a manner similar to how savings are accumulated for retirement. Thus, on a macro-social basis, our society has stopped actually being about growing, but rather spending the savings of the previous era. This is a classic sign of decadence or decline. The prerogative of our society is to increase capital as much as possible so the boomers can live out their retirement pleasantly. This is also paralleled in the mass population collapse I talk about in this video, where this is exactly what you would expect out of a population in decline. The bubble will burst at some point since there just aren't enough young people to replace the boomers. What this means is that when the elite says the economy is good, what they really mean is that it's doing its intended purpose. There's this whole new term which I really love, in that a system's purpose is what it does. The purpose of our economy is to increase the value of capital so that the boomer ruling class can have comfortable retirements. Before the youngers get too angry, which I think is totally deserved, keep in mind that we do live in an era of scarcity. Thus, for the boomers, they actually financially do need to do this. If you take this away, you will have an entire older generation with nothing to do, and who don't have any money to support themselves, which is a giant social issue in of itself. That being said, this is exactly the conundrum you would expect from a demographically aging country. Or how much do you extract resources from the young working population to support the elderly? Part 3, False Economy. I'm naming this chapter in honor of one of my favorite economics books, being False Economy by Alan Beatty, which I would highly recommend. And it's an economic history of the world through the lens of asking paradoxical questions, like why is Argentina poor and America rich? Or why doesn't Africa produce cocaine in the same manner South America does? And it ends up with the thesis that I've found basically all honest economics explained books come to, that there is a world of difference between the things politicians sell about what's good for the economy and what's actually good for the economy. And instead, we build this false economy around what looks good on paper, but in reality is disastrous. A couple months ago, I read a brilliant book named Bull Jobs by David Graeber. The thesis of the book is that around 40% of jobs in modern society accomplish nothing. On top of that, a very significant amount of the people who actually do have useful jobs spend a large amount of their time doing useless tasks like paperwork or meetings. The irony is that even people who work at these jobs will admit that their jobs do nothing. David Graeber is my favorite left-wing author, and the thing about this book that was so good is that it digs really deeply into the issues of the modern economy. How is it possible to have a society in which probably a majority of work that's done accomplishes nothing? The answer shows more and more the further you get into the rabbit hole. Our entire society is built off fake money, which shows the lie that will destroy our entire economic system. The government has printed a truly ludicrous amount of money over the last 4 years. I can't even quantify it, and I don't believe the numbers, but I heard that it took us 250 years to reach the levels of debt we had in 2014, and we have doubled the number since. America spends more money on paying off the interest on its debt than the military, and keep in mind, interest is only 5% of the total debt. How are we going to pay the rest? This is the greatest degree of money printing ever in human history. The scary thing is I don't think the people who actually are part of this process are intelligent enough to know what's happening, which is completely insane, given we are the society which has put the most effort into teaching people economics of any ever. And I was watching one of the most cringe and black-pilling videos of my life with an interview of Jared Bernstein, who is the guy who runs this sort of thing, and they asked him, how come the US government prints money, and then after that there are loans between different government departments on money that they just printed? And he literally didn't have an answer. And you guys should watch it, where he just waffles and doesn't have an answer for it. I have multiple friends who used to work at the Fed, and I asked them this question: does anyone at the Fed know about the 17th century Spanish financial crisis? And the reason I asked that question is that the 17th century in historical terms isn't that long ago, and what Spain did in that time period is incredibly comparable to what America is doing today, with just insane money printing to get around budget issues. And they gave me the same answer, that no one at the Federal Reserve knew that kind of economic history. And the thing that further shocked me is they said that the people actually believed this stuff. And I always thought modern monetary theory was a cynical ploy to manipulate the populace. But no, people actually unironically believe it. And I find this difficult to believe that no one involved has read a single pre-industrial economic history. Again, let me repeat this. This is amongst people whose entire job is to study economics and how it works. The money printing seeps into every single aspect of the society to a certain degree. It was tolerable for most of the post-World War II era, but now the contradictions are becoming absolutely insane. In some ways, our entire society is a reflection of our financial system, in which the government prints infinite money as a way to escape reality. This kind of logic is reflected in our entire clown world, in which we think that we are at the end of history, you can change your sex, or that we're on the verge of utopia. We've reached a point in which the dominant economic system of our society is modern monetary theory, which says that you can print infinite money and somehow the economy will grow faster. The thing is that this theory has been tested for thousands of years. Governments have tried this money printing in so many previous eras of history, whether 17th century Spain, 18th century France, 20th century Germany, 3rd century Rome, 17th century China, and dozens of other times over history. The result is always the same, that it blows up the entire society. Something I really loved about Graeber's book is he called our society managerial feudalism. A small working class produces the actual things of value, and then it is distributed among the managerial or bureaucratic class. They run society and thus push their own interests, thus resulting in the ever larger bureaucratic bloat you see in every organization. These people often aren't necessary, as we've seen with Twitter, where Elon fired 90% of the employees there with basically no repercussions. The thing is that the government is beholden to so many special interests that they keep printing money in order to keep everyone happy in a rough, scarce world, so they can keep getting reelected or maintain their right to rule. Around the world today, governments stay in power by keeping the economy good. The problem is that this pushes short-term mindsets and shortcuts, which eventually eat the entire system. The reason so much money printing has resulted in less inflation than it should warrant is that every government in the world is doing this at the same time, since they're all desperate. Thus, everyone cancels everyone else out. Leftists will seethe at me saying this, but the West or America have not been capitalist since World War II. The reason I say this is that in America or the Western countries in general, the government makes up half of the total economy. Well before World War I, it hovered around 5% in Britain and other similar countries. The private sector, which is also intertwined with the government for either funding or regulations, so that half is a lowball number. What this means is the economy is not actually based off the free market, but rather what the government wants. I'm not going to push this theory too far, where we're definitely not Stalinism, where there is a private market, but I would say that America is a mixed economy between socialist and capitalist. Hayek in the 40s wrote a book called The Road to Serfdom. What he said in it is that the end point of government interference in the economy is that over decades, the entire economy would become dependent upon the government. The populace would gradually be turned into serfs who would serve the government's buddies. Although we don't like to think it, this has already happened. We've already seen most of the population turn into permanent renters, whether for their cars, homes, TV shows, farm equipment, utilities, or they're stuck in permanent debt for their education. The vast majority of them end up working in companies in which they have no stake. They're told how to live for most of the hours of their day by their boss. They are effectively serfs. If you look at the elite with the WEF as an example, they want to push this process further with saying, you will own nothing and be happy. Alternately, you notice the WEF types in the World Economic Forum is generally a weather vane for the elites across the West, as they will always push for renting or collectivism. Meanwhile, large corporations support regulations since they crush competitors. Large organizations, in most cases, are the people pushing for regulations since they have the money and lawyers to face all the competitors while the mom and pop shops don't. Where I grew up, we had a bamboo infestation. The guy we paid to cut down the bamboo had to massively raise the costs of his work and even nearly stop doing his business since the government demanded he get a new environmentally friendly truck, which costed him an extra $30,000. What would often happen in this sort of thing is that he wouldn't be able to afford that and would thus start working for a larger company as an employee. This is how in 1920, 90% of Americans worked in small business or were self-employed, while in 1990, 90% of Americans were employees at a big company. You see that once the economy becomes about appealing to the free government money, all the weirdness starts to make sense. For example, the inflation money naturally flows into the stock market. A great example of this is the massed government welfare programs that took place during COVID also happened to coincide with the fastest growths in inequality in American history, in which normal people spent their COVID checks at Amazon, which then went into Jeff Bezos' pockets or the Amazon stock. That stock in turn went to other stocks. Thus, the stock market sucks up the value of the real economy. This is how the stock market can be doing really well, while the public in general is not. Secondly, this explains why so many corporations are going for woke DEI stuff, which is actively killing their profits as companies. Like, why is Disney making movies no one wants to watch? Or why companies will go so hard for woke people who make up 10% of America's population and a truly minuscule amount of their global market? This is since their real aim is to get funding from the big woke finance firms like BlackRock, since there's more fake money in the economy than real money. Thus, they get more money by playing along with these political games. Richard Hanania, who's a fan of this show and who I interviewed on my second channel, wrote a book called Origins of the Woke. It does a great job of explaining how wokeness started with the rules on government funding or harassment law. Effectively, companies had to push wokeness since they would get sued by the government or wouldn't be able to get funding if they didn't. As the percentage of the economy which was fake money increased, the need to push the party line to get said fake money also increased. I watched a good video on Luke Smith's YouTube channel, which is a good channel for anyone who's interested in these kinds of topics, which was his own synopsis of David Graeber's book. What he said is that these bullshit jobs exist as a side effect of government money printing. Effectively, in an inflationary currency, you need to keep working since your savings lose value. Thus, in order to maintain the right to rule, the government had to create lots of artificial managerial jobs in order to keep the ruling class satisfied at the expense of the lower classes in order to maintain control over the society. The fakeness of all this money is shown in how ridiculous the housing market is. The prices for housing are the highest they've ever been in history. The irony, though, is that no one is buying houses, so the houses are kept very high while the demand is low. In a normal economic system, the prices would go back down so that people could buy them. Yet, in a mostly fake economy, the fake money goes into housing where it's a stable asset, in that a house will always be there while the value of the currency gets worse. This is very similar to the economic issues before every secular cycle. What happens is the government prints money which is basically given to buddies of the regime. For example, in 17th century England, the economy became dominated by monopolies given by the buddies of the regime. Meanwhile, this creates a large class of very competent, dissatisfied people who launched the English Civil War. England's debts became horrifying, and in the need to balance the budget, the country spiraled into civil war. I've said before that most of my videos are really about explaining two historic events that are happening at the same time now, and those which I believe will happen soon are the coming civil war or the population and mental health crisis. With all these videos, I've made the conclusion that we are a bubble, and our entire age is a bubble that is about to burst. This is true politically, economically, culturally, socially, demographically, and in every other way you could imagine. The insane delusions of our age are an attempt to cope with this bubble bursting. The collective zeitgeist knows in its bones that something is wrong. That being said, we try every single method we could in order to avoid having to see it. Government stimulus is like drinking in that it provides short-term relief, but the more you do it, the worse it gets. Well, if you do too much, it becomes an addiction or could kill you. We're at the point where we're trying to get blackout drunk to forget we're drinking. We're also alcoholics in denial. I don't know exactly how this is going to play out, but the bubble is on the verge of bursting. The stock market can only not reflect the population for so long. This silliness is just insane, and it's reaching a point in which people realize that everything is not right. In the future, this era will be remembered as that bizarre period when an insane society was trying to deny reality with all its force, when we realized we weren't God.